And again, what we see here, especially what's been written by people who study history, as well as people who have lived through those times, the 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 sentiments, the cultural and the cultural sentiments of that time was to demonize certain racial groups and to use that as justification for such cruelty against them. So the broader context of racial harm. So throughout history, many racial and ethnic groups have faced discrimination, prejudice, and violence. And many of us might be very familiar with some of these historical events, such as the trans-Saharan slave trade. Between the 17th and the 19th century, between 10 and 12 million Africans were enslaved and transported to North Africa and the Middle East. More within the American zeitgeist, maybe within the American context, the Atlantic slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade between the 16th and the 19th centuries, where European traders, African intermediaries, and crop plantation owners enslaved between 12 and 15 million Africans to Brazil, the Caribbean islands, Spanish America, and North America. So we see slavery using humans as a currency, using humans as commodities, strong men, as well as women and children, so culturally embedded for many, many centuries, intracontinentally within Africa, among or between tribes and nations within Africa, but also intercontinentally to the Far East, to the Middle East, as well as to North and South America and the surrounding islands. Not only in deep history, but also more recently, more closer to home, where I'm from, South Africa, the apartheid system between 1948 and 1994, where it was a legal requirement to segregate and to discriminate against black and colored people. It's a different racial categorization in South Africa, and Indian South Africans. Previous talks mentioned interracial marriages. That was prohibited, by the way. Separate schools, separate churches. That was according to law, at the risk of punishment, of harm. In Europe, anti-Semitism leading to the pogroms, the Holocaust. We're very, very familiar with that history, as well as discrimination against the Roma and the Polish people. So this is along racial lines, but we also know that there was discrimination and aggression against other groups as well, such as homosexuals, people with intellectual disabilities and congenital conditions, as well as the Bibelforscher or the Jehovah's Witnesses during that time. And then also the Rwandan genocide around the time when democracy was established in South Africa. A genocide broke out in Rwanda. Between April and July 1994, Hutu militias targeted the Tutsis, that comprise about 14% of the population, the Twa people about 1%, for extermination. And some estimates are that between 500,000 and 1 million people were killed. And again, what we see here, especially what's been written by people who study history, as well as people who have lived through those times, the sentiments, the cultural and the cultural sentiments of that time was to demonize certain racial groups and to use that as justification for such cruelty against them. Such unfair discrimination resonates with all of us, mainly for two reasons. Because we have empathy. We have empathy with other people's suffering. In other words, we can think ourselves into the pathos or the passion or the suffering, the experience of others. That's the one reason. The other reason is we also instinctively want to be recognized for who we are. And this recognition for who we are is not necessarily for what we want people to believe about us, but to have a relationship with the other, where the other assumes a position where they are sincerely interested in us as individuals, not in us as tokens of certain groups, or not to relate to us only in stereotypical or in uncharitable ways. This creates unnecessary suffering in all individuals on the receiving end of racial discrimination, regardless of a person's race. Just because a person is black or a person is white or a person is Indian, whatever the racial category we might use in our country, doesn't mean that one person experiences, one type of race experiences discrimination, suffering less or worse than another person of a different race. This is particularly relevant to those in the helping professions, since our goal is to help patients, to help clients. And this is also a very controversial topic. We might find ourselves sitting with a client and counter-transferentially, like Leslie said, I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist too. Some of our sentiments might resonate with the person in front of us as the victim or even as the perpetrator, in which case it is necessary for us to be able to contain our counter-transferences and to allow this process to elaborate and to interpret that and to see what might be developing not only in the therapeutic relationship, but also to see how the person in front of us could somehow manage to gain greater control of their situation, whether they're on the perpetrator end of discriminating against someone who's white or on the receiving end of such perpetration. Now, I already said it. Perpetrating such discrimination on someone who's white. This is something that we don't often hear about in our contemporary times. But I am inviting you all to think about this, to think about the challenges related to a form of racial discrimination not often discussed or often thought about, namely anti-white discrimination and aggression. So put on your therapist's hat and think about such bias and aggression, its impacts on individuals and societies. Maybe we can think about also how to address this therapeutically. In the past, such discrimination has been downplayed, and we know how that ended. It only worsened their suffering, led to further tragedy. So I hope this space is safe enough and containing enough for us to also allow this to develop.